In this video, we're going to learn about the cut and stencil techniques, which are found as part of our outline properties. And before we begin, you need to check your technique selections box and be sure that stencil and cut are both turned on. Now we'll go ahead, travel to an empty workspace, and I'm just going to start by drawing a freehand line. Click and drag to draw my line and right click to finish drawing it. Right click again to stop drawing new lines, and now I have the line that we've drawn selected. And because it's an open shape and it's not closed, it will by default have no embroidery fill and an embroidery run stitch outline. And if I look at the properties box, this is where you'll find the options to change to a cut or a stencil. Now before I change from the run stitch to the cut or the stencil, I just want to point out, if I selected right now my file drop down menu and export, my options would be to export these embroidery stitches to things like my MB7 embroidery machine, or to Dropbox or to Quilt. These are because it's embroidery stitches. And notice what's missing or what's not here is to export it to a digital cutting machine, because there's no elements of this design which would be used on a digital cutting machine. Now, if we take this line that's currently an embroidery run stitches and change it to be a cut, now instead of embroidery run stitches, this line is a shape that would be cut out using a digital cutting machine. And notice now, if I look in the file drop down menu for export, that the options have changed, and I no longer have the embroidery machine as an option, but I now have to cutters as an option. And so that's just an example of how using the cut technique is about creating shapes that can then be cut out with a digital cutting machine. And so right now, the digital cutting machine would simply cut this line that we've drawn. And what I'm going to do is just zoom in more closely to that line, because I want to change the cut to a stencil, and I want you to notice what happens. So a cut will cut the line that I've drawn, and a stencil, I'm just going to switch now, will create a width around the line that I've drawn, and it'll cut the dark line that goes around it. And so that's where stencil and cut are different. Cut will cut the center of the line. Stencil will cut a width around that line. And of course, the parameters that you can change on the properties for a stencil are the width. So for example, it's set at 1.6. If I type in the number 3 and hit enter, it will make a wider stencil outline. And so on the cutting machine, what would be cut is the dark blue line. If we change it to the cut technique, then it's the pink highlighted line that's cut. But in the stencil technique, it's the outline. Now, when you have closed shapes, so if I take my freehand shape tool and click and drag to create some kind of a shape, and I connect my last point to my first point, that closes the shape. Now I'm going to right click to finish drawing that shape and right click to end drawing new shapes, and my shape is selected. And by default, because it's a closed shape, it has an embroidery step fill and an embroidery run line outline. And I'm going to turn the embroidery step fill off by clicking on none, which just leaves me the shape, which is currently an embroidery run line. And of course, we can come over and change the embroidery run line to be a cut line. And so now my digital cutting machine would cut out this line, which would in turn create a piece. If we were cutting paper, we would have cut this shape out of the paper. If we were cutting vinyl, we would have cut this shape out of the vinyl. So a stencil on a closed shape requires you to actually open the shape, because right now I can change this to stencil, but it doesn't actually create the outline width on my shape unless I add something that's known as a stencil bridge. So imagine the stencil being something that maybe you're going to use a pen to outline a shape or create like a template for that shape. So to be able to add the stencil bridge, we need to leave the selection mode and change to the edit nodes mode. So when I choose to edit shape nodes, this is where, of course, we can see the points of our design and we can select them and we could move them or delete them or add them, as always. But because we're using the stencil technique, if I right-click anywhere along the shape, I'm given the option to create a stencil bridge right here. Of course, I can also add a node or delete a node. Those are always there when you're using edit nodes. But add stencil bridge is specific to the stencil technique. And if I go ahead and add one right now, notice, first of all, this is the area where I right-clicked on my shape and said add a stencil technique. And it's actually, if I zoom in much more closely on that shape, you can see that it's actually broken the shape. Let me just undo. Okay, so we go to edit nodes. I can add this node anywhere wrong. Right here, right click, stencil bridge. See, so it's now split the shape right there and created the stencil outline. And you could have, oftentimes when we do this, we need more than one stencil bridge. The idea there is we don't want our stencil material to fall apart. We don't want the inside to become a hole which would fall away when cut. We want to simply make, now we've got the shape that we had originally drawn, and it's been broken in at least two places. So the inside and the outside are kind of independent. Maybe you want to add one more over here, stencil bridge. In this case, it's really just about ensuring that the inside of the stencil template and the outside of the stencil template remain attached together. And then you can use this stencil shape and put your pen in here and draw the little shape. Did you ever put names on your kids' clothes when they wanted to go to camp? Imagine if I create some text. I'll just put my initials in. Now this might not be a great text font to use for a stencil. Might work out great for cut technique. So in other words, if I turn off the embroidery fill and I change the embroidery run stitch outline to a cut outline, then the digital cutting machine would create the shape of the T and the shape of the T as a perfect cutout. But they're probably not really great for doing stenciling because they're rather narrow. And if you could imagine putting a stencil outline around, this stem of the T, there might not be much room left on the inside. So what if I selected, let's just select this again and change the letter style to be something more like a block font. I'll go all the way up to the top and just select one of these more bold style of letter styles. Okay, so again, this could be cut out. The technique is currently in the cut technique. If I change to stencil technique, it's going to want me to add that stencil bridge. Now, the only trouble here is when we use edit nodes with lettering, we're given the lettering handles to move the letters. And I don't have the nodes of those actual letters to edit. And so this is a time when you can learn to use the right click and choose to break apart your text. Now that I've broken apart that text, if I select on the letter T and choose edit nodes, see how I'm able to select those nodes? And now watch again, I'm going to right click and say stencil bridge. Maybe come across from it, right click here, stencil bridge. And so imagine now, let's just zoom in on this area closely, that you wanted to mark the letters TC on, somebody's clothes before they went to camp. You put your pen and you draw down the center of the line to the top of the T and the bottom of the T. And then when you take your stencil off, you can just connect that little line if you really want to. So when you're using the cut technique, it will simply cut the line that you want. When you choose to the stencil technique, it wants to cut the outline, and that requires us on a closed shape to add in, by right-clicking on the shape, a stencil bridge while using the edit nodes tool. And you can add in as many stencil bridges as you think are required for your shape. But that is how you can use the cut technique and the stencil technique.